30 years of investigation as a scientist have convinced me that the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs are alien vehicles. Furthermore, it is clear now that the government of the United States, some few people within it, have known since at least 1947, when a crashed saucer was recovered complete with 4 alien bodies outside Roswell, New Mexico, that indeed the planet is being visited. The subject is a kind of cosmic Watergate.
In March 1983, I was working on a documentary for Home Box Office entitled UFOs, the ET Factor. During research, I was taken to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where an Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent showed me several pages entitled Briefing Paper for the President of the United States of America on the subject of unidentified flying vehicles. The paper suggested strongly that our government has known for at least 40 years that extraterrestrials and their craft have been visiting this Earth.
Starting in 1976, Freedom of Information Act requests were filed with the U.S. government. These Freedom of Information Act requests asked for any documents that various intelligence agencies might have relating to UFOs. Over the last 10 years, a number of agencies have responded and have generated several thousand pages of documents. These documents show that intelligence agencies in the United States government have maintained an interest in the UFO subject and tracked it for at least the last 40 years.
Since 1975, I've worked with nearly 200 people who have reported in great detail having been abducted and having been taken aboard UFOs for very bizarre physical examinations. This sort of procedure takes place from childhood on, as if these people are being followed like a tagged animal, something of that sort. I've worked with Army officers who have been abducted, psychiatrists who have been abducted, scientists who have been abducted, police officers, people from every walk of life. This is the core meaning of the entire UFO phenomenon. They are interested in us and they are studying us involuntarily.
Historically, Americans have been called to be the keepers of the flame of liberty, and that liberty depends on innovative thinkers, the free exchange of ideas, and people with a can-do spirit.
The flame of freedom speaks, the flame of freedom within each heart, the flame of freedom saith unto all.
Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, educator, and religious leader, interviews revolutionaries in every field who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. The forum you are about to see was filmed before thousands assembled at the Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana. Here, in a secluded valley in the heart of the Northern Rockies, concerned citizens of the world gather each summer to attend an international conference for spiritual freedom. They commune with life, meet old friends and new, and hear the flame of freedom that speaks through Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests at Summit University Forum. Listen as Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests discuss the critical issues of the day.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. I'm Elizabeth Clare Prophet. First, the official explanation. UFOs are weather balloons, conventional aircraft, or the planets Venus and Jupiter. Whatever they are not alien spacecraft. But secret government documents and confidential informants tell a much different story. Is the United States government involved in a massive cover-up of its knowledge of alien visitors from other parts of the galaxy? Here to help us answer this question, Stanton Freeman, a nuclear physicist and authority on government secrecy and UFOs. Linda Moulton Howe, award-winning producer of over 350 television programs including a documentary about UFOs and animal mutilation called A Strange Harvest. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an expert in visual optics and lasers who works for the Navy and is chairman of the Fund for UFO Research. And Bud Hopkins, the nation's foremost authority on the UFO abduction phenomenon, author of a national bestseller on the subject, Intruders, The Incredible Visitations at Copley Woods. Linda, Bruce, Bud, and Stan, welcome to Summit University Forum. Stan, you talk of a cosmic Watergate that spans 40 years. What's involved?
It appears that since that original crash recovery, which we'll go into later, that a small group within the government has made sure that it has used all the intelligence agencies to collect information that gets sent into the hub, the secret group at the middle, and that the public has only been made aware of the external aspects of that. The old Project Blue Book, which people were aware of, was apparently a cover operation. They were a place that people could report sightings, but their job really was pretty much to debunk. They weren't the ones who dealt with the hardware, with the hard cases involving, for example, the Air Defense Command. The only guys with the good equipment are the military. They can pick up anything flying by, they can monitor it with instrumented aircraft, they can cross-communicate so several different systems can get together at one time. I got some idea of the dimensions of this in the course of my lecturing at something over 600 colleges, all 50 states, 8 provinces. I've run across hundreds of military people who tell me bits and pieces of the story, cases that they were involved in which didn't get reported to Blue Book and about which they were told to shut up thereafter using national security. I worked on classified programs for 15 years myself, so I had a pretty good handle on that. The first glimmer I had of this cover-up was when I found the largest study ever done of flying saucers for the government, which isn't mentioned in any of the anti-UFO books, incidentally, Project Blue Book Special Report 14. And if we see this on the screen, you'll see the cover of a document that covers more than 3,200 UFO sightings. They did an evaluation of every one of these sightings. This was done for Project Blue Book, United States Air Force group, by a group called Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. They looked at 3,200 cases. Everyone was categorized. They did a quality evaluation of all these sightings. And the public was given a story that showed up in papers across the country. And I was shocked after reading the document to see what the public had been told. The press release was in the document itself. The public was told by the Secretary of the Air Force, mind you, that on the basis of this report, no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. That sounds pretty straightforward. Only 3% unknowns. It was just the ones we didn't have enough information for, so there's nothing to flying saucers. And they went on to say that soon you'll be seeing things that look like the drawing that was used on the cover here. And if you see one, don't worry about it, it's ours. That was the tone. The same kind of tone has been carried forth. The only problem with that explanation was when you look at the data from the report, here's a breakdown of these 3,201 sightings. That's a lot of sightings. And they were all investigated by professional people. They found that 21.5% were unknowns, not 3%. And that these were completely separate and distinct from those sightings which were listed as insufficient information. A separate category. If there wasn't enough data, sighting absolutely could not be listed as an unknown. They also did something rather unusual. They did a quality evaluation of all the sightings. Because the obvious response to those might be, well, yeah, but how do we know that those unknowns aren't just those 3-second observations at 2 in the morning by the town drunks? You know, a lot of crazy people around. They did a quality evaluation of all those sightings. What they found was the shocking thing, in a sense. What they found, as you can see here, is that the better the quality of the sighting, the excellent sightings, 35% were unknowns. By the time you get through the good, the doubtful, and the poor cases, we're down to 18% unknown. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be an unknown. Exactly what you'd expect if the unknowns were something different. So this study raised all the questions. You look in the body of the report, excellent work. It's clear that they had a very good collection of very exciting reports. And if you even focused only on the excellent sightings, there were loads that indicate we're dealing with manufactured objects whose behavior clearly indicated that they weren't manufactured here. This study was done more than 30 years ago. And yet the public was told something completely contradicted by the data in the report, never distributed the report. So that was the beginning of my awareness more than 20 years ago of the cosmic Watergate. Now, I'm familiar with a different kind of security. One of the areas that people get into on flying saucers is technology. You can't get here from there. Used to be a common argument. Man can't go into space. People here might even remember when that was thought to be the case. So there is naturally security about advanced technology development. And I brought along a picture of a nuclear rocket engine. This one very much like this, less than 7 feet in diameter, had a power level of 4,400 megawatts, 4.4 billion watts of energy, and something like this. This was a nuclear rocket engine that was successfully tested more than 20 years ago. Now, most people, the details of the test were classified. I've worked on a whole host of programs where the existence of the program wasn't classified, but the details were classified, performance characteristics of the engine. With flying saucers, what I've found is that it tends to be a black program. The total estimated budget last year for black programs over which Congress has no say, and which involve billions of dollars, and where the public doesn't even know that the program exists, unlike this program. The total budget was estimated to be $35 billion in 1 year for 200 black projects.
It's astounding.
Yeah, for those who think governments can't keep secrets, let me definitely get rid of that notion. I've helped keep some secrets myself, not about flying saucers. But projects like this, that's not something built for Hollywood. That thing was operated out in Jackass Flats, Nevada. Don't blame me for the place. Successfully tested. This is hardware. This is nuts and bolts. It appears that we have pieces of extraterrestrial hardware that have been recovered complete with extraterrestrial bodies. It's a startling story. And I'll do one more thing about physical kind of evidence. A lot of people seem to be unaware that all over the world we have reports of things, flying saucers if you will. All flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. I always lecture about flying saucers, not UFOs. From all over the world, we have something like 2,500 physical trace cases where a saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes in the ground, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, that sort of thing. And about 20% of those cases involve reports of creatures to go with the saucers, even some cases of footprints. That's from 65 countries. And it gets dull. You look at enough pictures and you can't remember which place was that. The same kind of physical traces are seen. Now, if the government has such data, which I certainly presume that they do, they're sure not telling us their analysis of the soil, their interpretation of how those effects could have been produced, the kind of things that any physicist such as I would be very much interested in knowing. As a typical physical trace, there's a ring there of soil. This took place near Delphos, Kansas. And the object was seen on or near the ground. It took off. Afterward, the soil was different. In a ring 14 inches down, the soil was different in color and texture from the surrounding soil. Now, you can see some idea of the difference. You can see in part of this. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see soil in which seeds were sown and where the seeds didn't germinate. That's soil from the ring. Soil from just a few feet away, the seeds germinated beautifully, no problem. I had samples of this soil from the man who collected these 2,500 cases. And you can see what they look like. Oh, this was the ring soil with water on it. It doesn't absorb moisture. Pour water on it, runs right off, which is very strange indeed. I've worked on a movie where we show pictures of putting the soil, just plain old ring soil, on water, and it just sits there.
Floats.
Yeah, you take the normal soil and it sinks right to the bottom. This is peculiar stuff. So I had good tests run. In this slide, you can see the ring soil on the left, the normal soil on the right. They're obviously different in color and texture. When I had good laboratory tests run, the ring soil had a higher level of soluble minerals, calcium, phosphorus, potash, the standard stuff. So this is one direction for UFO research that most people have never heard about, but that exists. Physical trace cases from all over the world. Now, of course, the exciting part is this part of the story. These guys, and we also have stories like this from all over the world, and we'll get into a lot of stories. The first publicized UFO abduction case wound up with this bust being done from drawings done by an artist sitting next to one of the people that was abducted, namely Barney Hill, the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction case in New Hampshire way back in 1961. Now, that case really got the ball rolling because there was a book, there were 2 articles in Look magazine, television movie came out, the UFO incident, and very intriguing to me as a physicist. I was an advisor on the movie, but the most intriguing part of the story was the star map that was seen by Betty Hill, and where a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish built 23 different 3-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. A massive amount of work. And from that work, was able to determine that the apparent origin of those guys was a planet around one of 2 stars, Zeta 1 or Zeta 2 Reticuli. You can't see them from here. You've got to go down to the equator to see them. They're just down the street in the galaxy, 37 light years away. That's, just around the corner, you might say. Well, 37 light years, the galaxy is about 80,000 light years across, so 37 is next door. But this is a fascinating story. If the government knows where these guys come from, and you have seen some documents which seem to indicate that, then it appears to be, this is the little booklet put out by Astronomy Magazine that reviews this star map work. Very controversial, comments from a lot of scientists. It convinced me that Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli just happen to be, incidentally, rather special. Not because they have crazy names, which is true too, but it's the constellation of Reticulum, the net. And what's special about those 2 stars is kind of mind-boggling. They're 37 light years away, that's no big deal, but those 2 stars are 100 times closer to each other than our star, the sun, is to the next star over. These guys got next-door neighbors. We're so far out in the boondocks we can't see the smoke from the next guy's chimney. And those 2 stars are at least 1 billion years older than the sun. At least 1 billion years. So it wouldn't be too surprising if there were earlier interstellar travel, when your nearest neighbor is only 3 light weeks away, and where you have 1 billion year head start on us primitive Earthlings. So we understand from certain documents that Linda has seen that the government knows that they originate on one of these 2 planets, Zeta 1 or Zeta 2 Reticuli, apparently by first-hand communication from an alien. Now that's exciting stuff.
What's really exciting is that Betty Hill herself is a very convincing speaker.
She was a social worker. Her husband was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission for the state of New Hampshire. They came across extremely well. I was lucky enough to spend hours with them before Barney's death, of course. And that case set the right tone for abduction cases. I think Bud will get into that. But they're reputable people to whom something quite incredible happened, and where we've got the backup of this star map work, which is complex and exciting and intriguing.
Let me just clarify one thing. The briefing paper did not specify Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. That came up in discussions that were separate from the paper. But Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 has been referenced by more than one person, separate from what Stan is saying, and in addition to the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Well, didn't Betty bring it out under hypnosis?
Well, she was asked to relive part of the experience. They had 3.5 months of weekly separate sessions, Betty and Barney, with a psychiatrist. In one of these sessions, Betty is reliving a portion of the experience where she's asked the alien, "Where are you from? I know you're not from around here," the understatement of the year. Finally, to get her off his back, he shows her this, what I can only describe as a star map, a three-dimensional model about 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, with points of light that were supposedly stars, and with different lines between the various points of light. Now, she asks, looking up at this thing, "Where are you on the map?" The wise guy alien says, "Do you know where you are?" She says, "No, I don't know anything about astronomy." "Well, if you don't know where you're at, I can't tell you where I'm from." End of discussion. The psychiatrist, who by this time his mind is blown because they've gone through the abduction and all the rest of this, asked her to go over the story again and gives her, asked her, "Can you remember what the map looked like?" Not knowing what he's getting into at all. He gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. "If and only if you can remember it accurately, please draw it later on." And she did, and brought it into the next session, and it was in the book, and this woman, Marjorie Fish, saw it in the book, thought, "Oh, this is a bunch of malarkey, they can't look like us at all, and all. But here's something we can check, let's do it." So she built 23 different models. It's a tremendous job, because the astronomers, not being excited about going anyplace else, don't have very accurate data on where the stars are. They know where to aim a telescope, but they don't know how far out. It doesn't matter if you're not going there. You get 5 different star catalogs, you get 5 different distances for the stars. So it took a tremendous amount of work on her part. And one of the intriguing things about the map is her identification of the stars couldn't have been done by anybody using the best data available when the experience took place. It was new distance data that enabled her to identify the stars in the pattern, all of which were sun-like stars, which is quite remarkable. Only about 1 in 20, or about 1,000 stars within 54 light years of here. Let's talk about the neighborhood. Without 54 light years in a sphere around where we are, there's 1,000 stars, only 46 are similar to the sun. So that's 1 in 20, roughly. And yet all the pattern stars are the right kind for planets and life. And even more intriguing, all the right kind for planets and life in that well-defined volume of space that Betty saw are part of the pattern. So you got it coming and going both ways. That's a very unlikely thing if you take a dozen stars which are in the pattern at random, and they turn out to be only the right kind for planets and life, and all the right kind in that well-defined region of space. So quite a remarkable effort, and this booklet goes into that in some detail.
It's tremendous data. Just tremendous.
It's very exciting. And Marjorie has described to me how excited she was after months of effort and nothing happening, and she redid the model to match the new list of stars that came out at that time. There was the pattern. It was terribly exciting for her. And for me too.
Thank you. Is that all your slides? You got a couple more?
I think we'll stop there. We won't get into the crashed saucer yet.
Okay. We'll talk to you, Linda. Journalists tend to be skeptical about UFOs and people who say they saw them. Yet you did a documentary investigating the link between UFOs and cattle mutilation. What first prompted you to do that?
It started with a phone call one cold, windy night in Boston. I was producing medical programming with Dr. Timothy Johnson, who is the ABC editor, medical editor now, and back then we were working inside the ABC station in Boston, and I was doing all the medical programming. And on the other end of the phone call was my brother's excited voice saying, "Linda, a UFO has set down on the base." And he was excited and just beside himself. For my brother, it was unusual. And he was working at Malmstrom Air Force Base as a helicopter pilot. He'd come back from Vietnam. And he and others were at a wing party that night, and all their beepers, they carry what they call bricks in the Air Force, and they started going off, and men scrambled for the telephones and to get their various assignments. And the story that he understood, so I'm telling you what my brother told me firsthand, was that there had been an electronic intercept over one of the missile silos known as Kilo 7 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is near Great Falls in Montana. And a sabotage alert team, also referred to as a SAT team, had been ordered to go and identify what it was that was electronically interrupting the electronic security system around the missile silo. And my brother pulled into this drama is scrambling into a helicopter with security police to get to the missile site. And there's radio chatter that is going on, and 2 jet interceptors were scrambled. And while all this is happening, the SAT team, which has a visual now on this Kilo 7, is radioing back that what they are looking at is a football field size, which would be 300 feet, glowing disk hovering low over, but not on the ground, but above the missile site. And the phrase was used then, and I've heard it so many times since, putting out light that is brighter than daylight. I don't know myself what that means. And the SAT team radioed back that they were not going any closer than a quarter of a mile. And there was discussion about that they should go forward, and they said, if you want to come closer, you come out here. So with this insubordination going on the line, the SAT team sits there, the jets come, and when the jets got within eyesight of the SAT team in the air, whatever this orange glowing thing was, blinked out. The jet interceptors radioed back that whatever it was disappeared. The SAT team is saying, no, it's there. We know it's there. It has just disappeared. And the jet circled. My brother is still in a helicopter trying to get out there. The jets go back. And as soon as the jets have left the site, it blinks back on. It's right there where it was. And the SAT team tells the command post, it's still here. It's just come back on. And it simultaneously began to rise slowly, and it was picked up on radar, and it Dopplered off at 200,000 feet. At exactly that same time, there were animal mutilations being reported in and around Malmstrom Air Force Base, and my brother heard about that firsthand from a flight surgeon. They were friends. A rancher brought a cow in the back of a pickup truck onto the base and asked the base to explain to him what had happened to his cow. And there was a very strange slit in the lower lip. It was what we call the classic, where an eye is removed, an ear is removed, sexual organs are removed, and the rectum is cored out. And the flight surgeon told my brother that on examination of the muscle tissue, it was so thoroughly drained of blood that it was a pale pinkish white, not even the color as you would find meat in a supermarket. So I was hearing these stories from my brother, and I had some newspapers that had been sent to me from my parents in Idaho and my brother about these strange animal mutilations. But I was working on human medical television programming. These were anomalous things. They were interesting and they were provocative. But when my family and I moved to Denver in 1976, I took a position as being director of special projects at the CBS station there. And the UFOs and animal mutilations were not in any way, shape, or form connected in my mind, and neither were any of the stories from my brother. It was past history, something that had happened in the fall of 1975. By 1979, 4 years of doing science, environmental issues, a series of live programs, documentary films, having absolutely nothing to do with any of this. In the summer of 1979, while I was doing actually a theatrical docudrama, there were articles that began appearing in the newspaper about these mysterious animal mutilations again. And this file that I had had in Boston, I got back out again and started filling up the newspapers and decided that fall that I was going to take a look at what is this? What could perhaps be responsible for deaths of animals that has been going on for 4 years. That's what I thought then, 4 years. And I began research in September of 1979, and within 3 weeks, I had talked with maybe 75 people, ranchers, deputies, sheriffs, fellow journalists, and I was hearing one off-the-record UFO story after another. I'll talk to you about what happened. This is what I saw. I will not talk to you on film about UFOs. I'll talk to you about the animal, or I'll talk to you about a light that may have been a helicopter, but people did not want to talk and use the term UFOs or anything that they felt would embarrass them. Or in the cases of veterinarians, there was one veterinarian that I talked to back in '79, and one I talked to in great detail in 1980 on a case, and one in '82, who said that he would never talk on the record with me because he did not want to jeopardize his professional standing as a veterinarian, but he had no explanation for how the eyeball and an optic nerve was removed from an animal. So as I started into a film that I thought might be a contamination story, and I ended up 9 months later producing a film called A Strange Harvest, which was an accumulation of human testimony that seemed to largely be associated with circumstantial evidence of strange lights and bloodless animals with cookie-cutter cuts.
I think most of us remember the articles, especially those of us who lived in Colorado at that time. They were going on all over. In fact, one happened right at the Broadmoor Hotel in the zoo there, and the prize buffalo was mutilated.
There was a buffalo mutilated in the zoo.
That's
on
right.
the way up to NORAD.
That's right. And we lived probably a few thousand feet from the site of that mutilation. And I can remember waking up one morning only to discover that the owner of the hotel was absolutely profoundly grieved that this prize animal had been mutilated. And it certainly sickened the neighborhood.
And it was classic. It was the cored out rectum and the missing eyeball.
Right.
And we'll get into this, I think, in a while, is that there is a pattern. The thing we're talking about is a specific high strangeness of a pattern of cuts, separate from predator, separate from satanic cults, and separate from disease.
Exactly.
It's not only cattle or buffalo,
That's right.
horses too, and
Horses, goats, sheep, dogs, cats, rabbits, birds, worldwide.
Reports.
Canada as well as the United States.
Canada, the United States, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Central America, South America, Australia, Canary
We'll
Islands.
get to why they are doing that very shortly.
It's worldwide.
Bruce, as a scientist, how did you get involved in the study of UFOs?
Well, it first caught my interest back in the 50s when, as a high school student, I would read occasionally stories. I lived up in Vermont, and or I guess from here it'd be over in Vermont. I would read stories about local farmers or citizens reporting strange things that they had seen, and then at the end of the story about some very bizarre occurrence, there would be some mundane explanation by an authority speaking ex cathedra, saying it was the planet Venus or some airplane going by or something like that. And it struck me that there seemed to be a disconnect between the explanation and the description of the event. And years later, when I became more involved in the subject in the late 60s and early 70s, I pursued this problem, which I had discerned in the explanations of UFO sightings. From my point of view, if the skeptics had done their work correctly and in fact had provided convincing explanations for all the early sightings and so on, I wouldn't be in it. When it comes to an explanation for a sighting, you can't be sure whether or not the explanation is right or wrong unless you have some independent evidence about what was seen, just by studying what somebody reports he saw in the sky or whatever. But although you can't tell whether the explanation is right or wrong, you can tell whether or not it is convincing. And the problem that I discovered was many of the explanations were just plain unconvincing. You would have to take a particular, very complicated case, perhaps describing a complex object that the person saw fly by and do right-angle turns and so on. And then if you explain that as the planet, in order to explain that as the planet Venus, you'd have to throw out 90% of the explanation and just grab onto the one point that it was a bright light in the sky, and ignore the fact that it made a question mark and did right-angle turns and then hovered for a while and then shot off at the speed of a jet. You could explain even politicians, I presume, if you were to throw away 90% of what they say. So I pursued that, and a little bit later maybe I can go into some of the specific details of cases that I have collected and analyzed that illustrate this point, the problem that the cases that have been publicized as explained in fact weren't.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the documents and the FBI documents?
Oh yes, I can
Like 1,600 pages of
Yes,
documents
well,
from the FBI?
That's kind of an interesting story because I was investigating a photo case from McMinnville, Oregon. It took place in 1950, and the witnesses claimed that they had been interviewed by FBI agents. And so I wrote to the FBI asking whether or not they had any record of interviews with, this is a Mr. and Mrs. Trent, formerly of McMinnville, Oregon. And I got back and I put in a letter, oh, by the way, if you have any other documents on the UFO subject, let me know. That was in the fall of 1976, and by law, Congress had mandated that they had to respond to Freedom of Information Act requests within 10 or 20 days or something like that. So I got back a letter with a number 32,653 or something like that, suggesting, you know, they've got a big backlog already, don't hold your breath for an answer. And I said, we're working on it. And then 6 months later, roughly, I got a call totally out of the blue from an FBI agent who said he had been handed my request and had researched the file, and to his great amazement, there was well over 1,000 pages of stuff in the FBI file. And would I be interested in having him go through and select out what he felt was the best and send it to me? Well, I had no idea of what was in the FBI file. I was completely surprised. And nowhere in the history of the subject, that is the history that was known up to that point, had there been any mention of the FBI, except that in a book published by Edward Ruppelt, the first director of Project Blue Book, he had made one little sentence, put one little sentence in there. His book was written in 1955. He had one sentence saying that the FBI had never investigated. And I found out that, you know, it was basically either he was lying or he didn't know. In any event, sure enough, the FBI was called in to investigate witnesses starting as early as July 1947, called in by the Air Force for two reasons, basically. One was to find out whether or not, or at least the FBI was told that they were to find out whether or not there were any subversives out there generating flying saucer reports, I guess to undermine the U.S. government or something. A second, more subtle reason was that the Air Force didn't have enough investigators to go around. They were totally flooded with reports, and so they needed help. The FBI got out of that investigation after a while, but over the next 20 or so years, they just accumulated documents. Now, the central headquarters of the FBI, by law, cannot destroy anything. Don't make the mistake of calling up the FBI. If you do, the first thing they will do will be to check to see if there's any record on you. The second thing they will do will be to generate a piece of paper which indicates that they got a call and that they checked. I found out another amusing thing, too. I don't know whether this is true or not. If it is, it's totally bizarre. I was told that they had to keep a copy, not of everything that they sent out to somebody who had sent stuff in. Now, they already had a big pile of these documents. If the guy was telling the truth, he had to copy every document that he sent out to me. So now he's got 2 copies of the document. Anyway, that's how the paper mill in Washington, D.C. works.
How many pages did you finally get, Briggs?
Well, there were around 1,600 pages out of the FBI file, and it covered the FBI's point of view of the early Air Force work. It had sightings in it which had not made it into the open literature, which were quite interesting. One of the sightings reported in the FBI file and also turned up in the CIA file, by the way, involved Senator Russell, who was the head of the Armed Forces, the Senate Armed Forces Committee from late 47 or 48 until he resigned, I guess, in 69. And he had a sighting that occurred while he was traveling, taking a train trip through Russia. And he had reported in great detail on all these Russian technological developments that he saw along his trip. After he got to Austria, the first stop he made after his long train trip, he was debriefed by an intelligence officer there, and after talking about the radar sets and the bridges and the railroad tracks, oh, by the way, we saw this thing while we were riding along in the train, 2 glowing objects that took off.
3 witnesses.
3 witnesses, and the CIA and the FBI sort of worked on that jointly, and ultimately, I guess, threw up their hands. But Richard Russell was quoted as one of the other people said that Russell had said to him, "We have been told for years that those things don't exist, but now I know it's true."
Now,
and he was one of the senators. He was the head of the Armed Forces Committee, ostensibly his committee has authority over what Army, Navy, etc., do in terms of their ordinary, well-known interactions as well as their intelligence stuff. But he didn't know about it.
There's an important thing about the FBI files. There are copies of numerous letters from J. Edgar Hoover himself to people who wrote in for information from the FBI about their UFO investigations, saying explicitly that it is not now, nor has it ever been, the role of the FBI to investigate UFOs. Here's this pile of FBI investigations of UFOs. And so you have the contrast. This is where the Watergate aspects. He's saying one thing publicly, as we find out many years later, he was clearly lying. And one of the key documents in the investigation of the Roswell incident is a document that fortunately had shown up in this big pile of stuff that Bruce eventually got, which is a flat-out statement from one FBI group to another that the wreckage that was recovered was not that of a weather balloon and was being sent up to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they await the results of the analysis. This is in this FBI document that's sitting innocently in this huge pile of stuff. And a second one was there too, with a comment handwritten from J. Edgar Hoover himself in July 47, right after the Roswell incident happened, saying that in a certain case, and you can't tell whether it's SW, Southwest, LA, Los Alamos, but anyway, in a certain case, they were not given access to the wreckage. Right, Bruce?
That's right.
And so it's very provocative. What wreckage? What are they talking about? And this is buried in those files. Now, incidentally, the other intelligence agencies were in the same boat.
What about the National Security Agency?
Well, the National Security Agency didn't release anything, but unfortunately for them, the CIA had communications with the NSA, and the CIA situation, of course, was much more tortured than the FBI. The FBI, I just wrote, send me whatever you've got. I didn't expect anything. They dumped 1,600 pages on me, ultimately. But the CIA, starting way back in the 60s, people had suspected that the CIA was perhaps running the show, and they said, well, we don't have anything. Then they owned up to having a document known as the Robertson Panel Report, and that was all they were admitting to up until the fall of 78, I think it was, when, lo and behold, as a result of a lawsuit, gee, we got 1,000 pages of stuff here, and they released those in December of 78. We went through, found that the CIA had been one of the world's greatest foreign UFO report collection agencies. I forget how many. There were several hundred sightings that they had collected from other countries. They also had some sightings from people here in the United States. There was no, well, in the summer of '52, the CIA records show that they decided to carry out their own investigation, and the first thing they did was they went and investigated this Project Blue Book, which was being run by the Air Force, and they concluded that Project Blue Book wasn't doing a very good job. In fact, the CIA document says, if all you wish to do is to determine whether or not a sighting could be explained or couldn't be unexplained. It couldn't be explained. If it could be or couldn't be explained, then Project Blue Book is okay. But after you've got a residue of unexplained cases, what do you do with it? These are the ones you should be working on. And Project Blue Book wasn't doing anything. All it was doing was say, well, we can explain these, we can't explain those, and now what's the next case?
We know what happened now, apparently, to the unexplained cases. That's where a super secret agency set up as a result of the recovery of the crash saucer. They apparently got the good stuff. They did the hard work. But let me follow up on Bruce's comment by saying the CIA also put out a list of 57 documents that they found originating with other agencies and which they therefore could not release. These were classified documents. You'd have to go to the other agencies. Now fortunately they listed all these documents, and every intelligence agency around was named, and the Department of State was named, and the Air Force Intelligence and Naval Intelligence. The most intriguing group were 18 from the super secret National Security Agency. You know, NSA means never says anything or no such agency. That's the inside line. Their budget last year was estimated to be $10 billion, more than twice that of the Central Intelligence Agency. The big outfit. They listen in on everything from everybody. Anyway, there were 18 documents.
They're
from,
listening.
Yeah. Well, undoubtedly now. The satellite going over is picking up the transmission. There was this list of 18 documents from the NSA. So naturally, a Freedom of Information request was filed with the NSA saying this list was given us by your friends at the CIA. We'd like these 18 documents. Now, what was listed was dates pretty much, no details as to what was in these things. We get back a response saying, we can't tell anybody anything, go away, don't bother us. A page and a half to say that, you understand. By law, we cannot release any information about sources and methods about intelligence gathering operations. We go back and say, we don't want the sources and methods, just give us the UFO stuff. We can't give you anything. We go around. A lawsuit is filed. I mean, we appeal, they deny, we go to court. They still insist that they can't release anything. Now, so far, all we know is that there are 18 documents, and that they're being stubborn about telling us anything about them. Okay, then we try a legal ploy. We ask that they do a search. That's the first step. The judge asks them, they come back to court a while later with, yes, we've done a search per your request, Your Honor. How many documents did you find? We expected the answer to be 18, of course. 239. But only 160 are ours. 79 with other agency. Fine, we say we'd like the 160, if you please. No, you can't have anything. We're going around the circle again. So we ask that this is the legal ploy really, because there is legal precedent for this. We ask that they show the 160 documents to the judge, because they keep saying national security, and we keep saying we don't want sources and methods information, which we didn't, just the UFO stuff. We had previously gotten other documents where most of the document is gone. But here's a small paragraph about a UFO sighting. They refused to show them to the judge, mind you. But what they did provide him with was a top secret document, an affidavit, 21 pages long, justifying withholding the 160 NSA UFO documents. The judge was so impressed by this document, which he saw in camera. Our lawyer didn't get to see it now. It's interesting legal proceedings here. It's the key document, we don't get to see it. He was so impressed by that in his 3-page ruling saying, yes, they should not release these documents, he mentions the affidavit and he says the public interest in disclosure is far outweighed by the potential damage to the security of the United States, or danger to the security of the United States, should these documents be released. National security and UFOs. We go to the Federal Court of Appeals. They normally take 2 months to reach a decision, a 3-judge tribunal, their oral and written arguments and so forth. They get shown the same 21-page affidavit. In 5 days, they agree with the lower court. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case. Naturally, a Freedom of Information request was filed for the top secret affidavit, this 21-page affidavit, and we got it. And here's a copy right here. And as you can see, it says top secret, and it's an affidavit, legal form, and all that. And boy, were we excited until we started going through the thing. Because they go through some preliminary stuff. They admit that they're NSA employees at UFO conferences. But as you can see, now I'm turning all these pages so you'll understand that I didn't just pick the worst ones, when 80% of the darn document is expurgated, isn't there? And you can't scrape off the black stuff. There's nothing underneath. They cut it out first. So a very simple question. Can we prove that the government is withholding information about UFOs? Yes, we can. The National Security Agency admits publicly and to a federal court judge in a legal affidavit that they have 160 of their own documents dealing with UFOs, which they have refused to release. Now, one of the skeptics says you can't keep a secret in Washington. If you could, the president would have hired them to keep, Nixon would have hired them to keep the Watergate thing from getting out. I have challenged him for 4 years now. Give me any of those NSA documents. They're real. We know they're real. Give me a reasonably unexpurgated version of this. Nothing to date. Now, there's a postscript to this story, too. 23 of the 79 other agency documents that the NSA says they found when they did their search originated with the CIA. So naturally, I filed a Freedom of Information request with the CIA. Gentlemen, we'd like the 23 documents you have that the NSA found that belonged to you. 35 months later, Bruce said 10 or 20 days. Well, the CIA doesn't believe it. It's sticking by that. 35 months later, I get a response from the CIA to my Freedom of Information request, and I got to look back through my files and which one was this, you know. Their response is that they are happy to provide to me the first 9 items. Unfortunately, what those were press abstracts of Eastern European newspaper articles, which I presume the Soviet Union had access to long before we did. Their own 14 documents they refused to release at all. Now, I have filed an appeal, and I expect by 1991 I'll be turned down on the appeal. So we can clearly establish without any qualms at all 160 and 14. There are loads of others we've been turned down on. But there's no question, if you look at the distribution list on some of the documents, that all the intelligence agencies were involved in collecting information about flying saucers through whatever channels they could manage. Foreign newspapers, listening in on foreign military communications, the NSA's job, whatever they could find. It was a primary focus, and we're talking at least a dozen agencies here. Everywhere you turn, they've got documents. There's no question there's a cosmic Watergate.
I might mention that we've heard about the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA now, and how there are sort of interlocking situations there. Other agencies, well, first of all, let me say that the Air Force, of course, was publicly known as the organization to call if you had a UFO sighting, and that was pertained up from, well, 1948 up through 1969 when Project Blue Book closed. So naturally you would expect that there would be a lot of documents in the Project Blue Book file, and in fact there were a lot. They were released after being sanitized. Names of witnesses and so on were removed. Those documents were released on microfilm to the National Archives in 1975, and anyone could go to the National Archives and read through these 92 rolls of microfilm, get the history, get individual sightings, you know, office memoranda that were generated, briefings that were generated, and so on by the Project Blue Book men. The Air Force had not only Project Blue Book, but the people who actually did many of the investigations were part of an organization called the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which you'll probably hear a term thrown around here, OSI, that refers to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. They had a file on sightings, many of which did not appear in the Blue Book file. Fortunately, those records were also collected and put in the National Archives. So those were Air Force records, literally tens of thousands of pages of stuff. Subsequently, we have found out that Army intelligence collected material, thousands of pages. I don't know exactly how many there was in that. Anyway, Navy intelligence has not come forth with very much.
They keep saying they don't have anything.
Yeah, we're not sure whether to believe them or not, because we know of particular sightings which have occurred on board naval vessels and so on. The Coast Guard has had sightings reported to them, including, you know, Coast Guard employees. Let me see, who have I left out
Defense
here?
Intelligence
Defense
Agency.
Intelligence Agency.
DARPA.
They released some too, I'm not sure.
I'm just questioning.
The NRO, probably, National Reconnaissance Organization.
Well, the NRO, you don't know what to write to when you write to the NRO. NRO, Washington, D.C.
Their budget was over $1 billion the year its existence was.
Anyway, I think the point is that these intelligence agencies have information come to them. They do not take the attitude that it should be ignored, especially if it's their own operatives that generate it. CIA documents had reports from CIA agents. The FBI documents had a report there was by an FBI agent. They saved the stuff, and so we have, I don't know, a conservative estimate of maybe 4,000 to 6,000 pages of materials that have been collected, which up until 10 years ago, nobody suspected existed at all. And this, of course, is all independent of information which has been leaked, i.e. stuff that has not come out under the Freedom of Information Act. We'll get into that, but that relates to things like the Roswell case and MJ-12.
I just want to say about the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, I went under Freedom of Information, tried to get more of their files, because everything that was in the Blue Book files from them, none of it was rated higher than secret. But from the people I had talked to, it was clear there ought to be some top secret material there. So since it was declassified before being put in there, obviously there was a residue that hadn't been declassified. And I went after that. And there was a lot of double talk and communication back and forth, long letters in which they're trying to divert me in other directions. Finally, they agreed to give me a list of all the OSI installations, about 130 worldwide. They said they'd done everything for me that they could, which was nothing. And don't call us, we'll call you. The guy's boss sends me. This takes months to do this. And then we later on, luckily, were able to get a copy of a telex, a message put out to the same list that they'd given me a copy of, telling their agents that they would expect that soon they should be getting a request from Stanton Freeman. They gave my address in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, complete address, under Freedom of Information for UFO data, and if such a request is received, do not, repeat, do not respond as required by Air Force Regulation 12-30. Instead, write him, and then the quote, what they told their people to do was if they get a request, write back to me saying, write headquarters. What they were supposed to do by the regulations was to get the information that I had requested out of their files, send it to headquarters for review, and notify me that they had done so, thus revealing the existence of this information. By telling me to write headquarters, they were bypassing that step, violating their own rules, and avoiding releasing information. So people have often asked me whether I've ever been bothered, and I'm sure, Bruce, you've been asked the same thing, and you too, but whether the government has ever bothered you, stood in your way, threatened you, you know, to shut up or we'll do something. I've never had that happen, but in this case it's clear. They were illegally shutting off a line of inquiry. And if there's nothing to hide, presumably you wouldn't do that. So I'd still love to see those files. Anybody knows where the OSI files are? I want them.
I'd just like to say, before we establish conclusively that there is a government cover-up, that one 4th of July in the 70s, we had a speaker by the name of Major General George Keegan, a retired Air Force intelligence officer. And he actually stood on the platform of our gathering and categorically denied that there was any reality or validity to UFOs. And the response of the audience was simply laughter and ridicule. And
he deserved every bit of it.
He stood there and defended his position, totally mindful that he was not speaking the truth and mindful of the fact that this was certainly an embarrassment, that someone of such intelligence and background should be not denying this before people who are fully aware that there are UFOs.
We got a document about 1979 put out by an Air Force General, Carol Bolender, who had been heavily involved in the lunar landing program, a document written in '69, in which his job was to review Project Blue Book right after the lunar landing in July of '69. It was his job to review Project Blue Book and see what should be done. Where should we go from here? Should it be canceled, or are they doing anything useful, or whatever? And in his memo, and we've never been able to find the attachments, there are at least 10 attachments mentioned in it, but in it he said, he's describing how if Blue Book was canceled, it really wouldn't matter, because reports of UFOs which affect national security are reported in accordance with JNAP 146 in Air Force Regulation 200-2, I forget what the number of it was. And he repeated later on, reports which can affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. This is a statement from an Air Force general. I found that general, he was still alive in 1979, and talked to him about it. There's no question about what he meant. There was a whole separate system. And we now know that Blue Book was the unwitting cover operation, sometimes very unwitting. So, you know, General Keegan was following orders, I suppose, the classic line of somebody who lies to the public because of security. Maybe he didn't have a need to know.
Well, let's say then that there is a very important reason why the federal government does not want the citizens of this nation or any nation to know what is going on.
Well, remember, the first rule of security is you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. You have to bear that in mind. And in the government, that's always a justification. Well, if we told you they read our newspapers too, they'd know what you know. We can't do that. So we will have to lie to you in order for them not to find out what we're doing, them being anybody else out there.
Nevertheless, it is our studied opinion that by this date of July 4th, 1988, there is something that we have to know, that we must know for our own vital security, for our own survival.
No question about that. When we talk about Operation Majestic 12,
Exactly.
you'll get a better picture of that.
So,
Another
Bud,
teaser.
tell us now what typically happens to someone who is abducted. You've studied thousands of cases.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I have been dealing with the phenomenon for a long time, and I know that when people come back from an abduction experience, very often what they remember is not exactly what happened. It's as if their memories have been altered, played with, whatnot, through some sort of hypnotic means. We don't know what happens. And we know that they have been told certain things sometimes, which are obviously not true, and there's a certain degree of deception in these abduction experiences.
On the part of the UFOs.
On the part of the UFO occupants. Now, that's a difficult thing to handle for me. And these gentlemen are handling the fact that you start with a deceptive UFO phenomenon, which is now being handled by a deceptive government. So they have doubled the problem as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I would prefer the smaller can of worms, which is what I try to handle, and leave them to this extremely labyrinthian search for truth within government deception about what is in fact alien deception. Typical problem, difficult problem. I once...
Government deception about non-alien deception is bad enough.
I once gave a talk before a small informal group of the United Nations, and informal, and I was making the obvious point about deception from the UFO occupants. And leading up to that, I said, and here were people of every nationality, race, location, and so forth in the audience. I said, first of all, there's deception up there, and of course we know that governments lie, and which I thought was just a truism, and the whole audience broke into hysterical laughter. It's as if that's the one thing they're trained not to say at the United Nations. And it was very nice for them to hear somebody say the government something they know all day long in their work. At any rate, there is deception in the UFO phenomenon from the beginning. Now I'd like to just outline how I came to write about it and so forth. I was doing investigations. I'm an artist, and this is something I do on the side, so to speak. But I made a discovery. I made a couple of discoveries that made me feel that I had to write a book about this. The first discovery I made was that with the Betty and Barney Hill case and very few related cases that we knew about, the Hickson case, the Travis Walton case, and so forth. There were not many cases in by 1975 when I got involved in this. There was a basic belief about these abductions, and that was that the person remembered sort of large chunks of it. They at least were aware that they had missed a period of time that was gone out of some kind of a trip, or that there were half memories or nightmares or something, the Betty and Barney Hill story. But I ran into a case where a man said to me, "But I think something happened to me on such and such a road." I said, and he said, "I think it involved UFOs." I said, "Did you see anything?" Doesn't remember seeing anything. I said, "Did you notice there was a time problem? You looked at your watch?" "No." And I said, "Well, what makes you think that?" He said, "I just had this feeling." And he said, "Every time I hit a certain stretch of highway," this is a trip I frequently make coming back and forth with my girlfriends, "I start to get panicked because I knew somehow that something happened to me on that stretch of highway." But there was literally nothing else that he could recall. We began to explore it. We used hypnosis, and out tumbled an abduction case, which was very much like the Betty and Barney Hill case, quite terrifying. And for the first time, we looked at one another and thought, this could have happened to anybody. It could have happened to anybody listening to us at this very moment, without their having much memory beyond such a very feeble clue as the terror of a certain place, which came on him at a certain point, and it was associated with the idea that something happened there. The second thing I discovered was that certain people had seemed to have been abducted in childhood and then re-abducted later. And we had always assumed in these cases that if somebody reported this kind of experience and then reported it again, even heavy-duty sightings, that we would sort of discount them because this didn't happen over and over again to the same person. But I've discovered in 2 of our cases that it seemed to have happened as if that person was, let's say, being tagged and followed, as I mentioned earlier, like a tagged animal. And the third thing I discovered was that 2 of the people I was working with, ultimately 3, reported scars that appeared sort of magically on their bodies as children when they had a missing time experience. The scar was up the back of the leg or whatever. I'll go into this in a second, but essentially the fact remained that they had no recollection of how these scars got there. They felt very funny, very queasy about the scars. They were remembered by the family as very unusual. And under hypnosis, they recalled the instrument that made the cut when they were on a table inside a craft in this experience. Well, those were 3, in essence, new pieces of information. I mean, other investigators may have run into them too. I'm not making that claim, but the point is that I thought it needed to be said. Ultimately, I said I wouldn't do anything more on the subject in terms of writing anything until and if there was some new information. What I began to discover flowing right out of that was that, granted, people were picked up as children, they were picked up again and again, they were tracked many, many times, in some cases many, many times. There's a situation that I'm working with now where there may be an abduction every couple of weeks with a particular individual. And what I began to discover is that that person, as an adult and becoming married and producing a family, had a very strong risk that the child that was produced by that marriage was also going to be abducted, as if a certain bloodline is being followed. And the family I was working with in a core way in this book had, across 3 generations, abduction experiences, even branches, the Kathy Davis case, and even branches of the family. I also found, and this, I will just go into this very quickly, and it is the most bizarre part of the whole thing, we had known from the early cases that there were apparently samples being taken of sperm from the males and ova from the females. And there seemed to be a very strong interest in the genetic side of this, which would, of course, explain why families are being tracked across generations. What ultimately I ran into, and this is going to sound like I've lingered too long at the checkout counter in some supermarket somewhere and read those god-awful papers, and let me just make a plea for everybody listening: stay away, from those things. Read the Reader's Digest when you're standing there. Don't read those little papers. There's always an us or a people that you can thumb through. But at any rate, what we discovered is that in a number of cases, women had, I only had 5 at the time I started the book, women apparently had been abducted, had been artificially inseminated in a very sterile laboratory situation, had found themselves pregnant, were not consciously remembering the experience, except that something odd happened around a certain time. They are then re-abducted, and in a number of these cases, through going to gynecologists and so on, it was established they were definitely pregnant. All of a sudden, magically, they were no longer pregnant after another odd experience, which, under hypnosis and through conscious recollection in a number of cases, they remember being re-abducted, and this developing fetus is removed. In this part of the story, even some of the males are involved, human beings. The people are ultimately, and this is the wildest part of it, re-abducted and are shown a tiny hybrid child, asked to hold the child. The UFO occupants are avidly watching to see the response of that adult human to the child, as if they're trying to learn by osmosis, or Lord knows how, what our human maternal and paternal impulses, feelings are, as if they're trying to learn not only how the reproductive system works, but how we respond psychologically and caringly about a child, as if they're just as hungry for that as they are for the genetic material. Now, I have Since the book has come out, and I kept certain details secret because I did not want book intruders. I did not want the people just to read the book and come back to me with the stories that they had picked up. I kept certain details that I had encountered in these cases over and over again, kept them secret so that I would have a way of checking the veracity of new people. And I can tell you that over and over again, people I've dealt with since then have filled in those details, and they're very bizarre and very specific details. Now, the basic pattern of this, and this is totally, this whole thing sounds very bizarre, I have to admit. It doesn't sound like anything any of us want to be true, including the people to whom it happens. Now, to go back to the basic pattern, a child is often abducted even from the crib as a tiny little child. I've worked now with a case which seems, because of the reaction of the child, it's a long story which I won't go into, it seems something happened to a child when the child was 9 or 10 months old. The child is often re-abducted, or maybe for the first time, as a little toddler or a 4 or 5-year-old. One of the cases involves a child who was on her little tricycle in her yard in Florida. The mother was inside cooking and looking out the window and watching the little child pedaling back and forth. And at one moment the child has disappeared, is gone, broad daylight. Well, of course, total panic set in. The mother rushes outside. The child is nowhere in sight, and the tricycle's gone. The mother called her husband, called the police. A search was set up. A man 7 miles away working in an orange grove suddenly looked around, and there was a little girl on a tricycle sitting in his orange grove, 7 miles away, 2 hours later. The little child was not crying as if she'd been lost for 2 hours, where's mommy, or something of that sort. The child just, what's she doing here? The man took the little child to the house, called the police, and the child was reinstated with the parents. Excuse me. Now, the mother later that night, the child had no recollection where she'd been. The mother later that night, when she undressed the child, found up the back of the leg of the child a very deep cut, a surgical-like incision, which was bloodless, painless. The child had no idea how it got there. There was no tear in the pants. We have many, many cases of what seems to be then a sampling of cells, very often on the leg, and very often there's never any tear in the clothing or something, and the child does not remember how it happened. That's the second thing that happens. And very often, another time in childhood, the child will remember, sometimes consciously and sometimes through the aid of hypnosis, that a needle with a little tiny 2-millimeter ball on the end with little projections, a needle is inserted up the nostril, again when the child is on a table in a UFO, unable to move. There's a breaking through up in the top of the nasal cavity, and when the needle comes back out, often there's pain connected with this. There's no little ball on the end. And in some cases, people have described the needle going in with nothing on it, and when it comes out, the ball is on there, which hadn't been in place before, as if these are put in and taken out. In some cases, they describe the needle going in through the ear, and in some cases through the eye socket, below the eye socket. We believe that these are some kind of monitoring device, possibly, or some way of locating the person, like a tagged animal. We do not know what these things are made of. We have not yet found one. Certainly they're not radio opaque, so we're not getting them on x-rays. I'm convinced that one day we will have one of these things. But the next thing that happens is that the person, through puberty, is picked up, and the ova and sperm sample are taken. And with females, this happens many times. There is often a gynecological examination involved. These experiences, which I will not go into, are very, very traumatic. The entire experience is traumatic. We have done extensive psychological testing with a number of abductees. We have found no sign of the kind of mental problems that one would associate with fantasists, someone imagining all of this. These experiences sometimes happen to a number of people together. I have one case that involves 6 people. In Ohio, they were coming back on a little hike, young people with an adult, and one of their little group ran ahead to the house to make some cocoa or whatever, and as they walked through the trees, suddenly there was this enormous bluish light shining on all of them. They felt they couldn't move. The next thing they knew, the light was gone. They described it as big as a baseball diamond in size. When it had gone, they felt very peculiar, and they were not lined up in the same way they had remembered being when the light first shone on them. They came into the house, and there was something like an hour to an hour and a half missing time. attested to by that one person who had run ahead, saying, where have you been all this time? They were not aware of the missing time. Well, I've done hypnosis with 2 of the people who were involved in that experience, and neither of whom had really been in touch with one another after this happened, and under hypnosis recovered virtually identical accounts. This is something that is not the product of a personal imagination. It is extraordinarily traumatic. It is extraordinarily upsetting to someone feeling helpless. Just a quick example, a man who I worked with, who was an Army officer, and 6'2", very macho young man at the time, an Irishman. He didn't like people messing with him. He recalled being on this table. The little figures were this tall around him. He couldn't move. Various examinations of the sort I've been describing took place. And he was deciding in his mind that when he could become mobile, he was going to make a break for it. Now, I don't know where he thought he was going to go. He might have found himself 32,000 miles up somewhere, but we don't know where he was except inside some kind of craft. He said, Bud, they turned me, or they lifted me up and turned me, and my feet went down to the floor, and he said, I just stood there. And it wasn't that I couldn't move, I just had no will, no ability, no desire to move. I just stood there like this. And this little man, about this big, came over with these long, thin, gray fingers, took him by the wrist. He said, he just turned me like this, and I just went with him. And he said, you know, Bud, I was the giant in that room, but I was the baby. This was not an easy thing for this man to admit. The helplessness, the sense of being not told anything. Nobody understands why. It is a severe kind of traumatic experience to undergo. And as I say, I've worked with people in every single walk of life, a couple of people who were nationally known in the entertainment field, a microbiologist. You can go through every kind of area. I have had 2 psychiatrists, 3 psychologists, and 4 psychotherapists come to me to have me, through hypnosis, explore their abduction experiences.
Many of these sound like the Whitley Strieber account.
Well, Whitley was one of the people I worked with, and it's a very confusing account for people who've read his book. He wrote the book extremely hurriedly. He found out that he was an abductee. We began looking into it, and he had written and sold a book on it within less than 6 months. And it's filled with real things that really happen, a lot of confusion and disorder, because it takes a long time to sort these things out, and a lot of speculation. So it's, even though he is genuinely an abductee, the book in many respects is not the book I would recommend to someone interested in the subject.
The book I would recommend is your book, which is why I've invited you to be on the forum today.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that the amount of data and the meticulousness with which you present it, and the repetitiveness of these experiences of so many people from so many walks of life all being the same, allows us to draw conclusions. And I suggest that anyone who is truly interested in trying to understand what is happening and why it's being done, and thereby going back to the mentality of these androids and those who have sent them, who are the masterminds of their scouting expeditions, should read your book. It couldn't be more thorough, and with that data, we proceed. Do you want to tie into this?
Well, there's a very provocative parallel to all of this, and it even includes similar geography. Bud finds that not only is it an isolated individual, but it can be families and generations. In the mutilation mystery phenomenon, there is one rancher east of Colorado Springs in Colorado who had on the same hill, year after year after year, for 5 springs, same month, same hill, mutilation. And it was such a consistent pattern that on the 6th spring, he literally did not put any animals on this pasture. And he called and told me, he said, I'm going to try it this year and see if I can get by without a mutilation. The geographic consistency, why is there a repetitive pattern in same geographies? That's one example, there are many. Why is it that one particular ranch in New Mexico has had 11 mutilations on the same ranch in the same pasture since 1978? The parallel with the bloodless cuts. In mutilations, we're talking about cookie cutter cuts. You're talking about an instance where sheriffs have had as many as 3 mutilation reports in one day, same county. They get to an animal that is warm to touch. That means it's dead only a few hours. A cookie cutter cut, the scrotum, the penis are removed in an oval, and there is no blood, and it's only as deep as the hide. Not even the lumen underneath the hide that is between the muscle tissue and the hide is removed. It's absolutely, cookie cutter was the word that was coined by a sheriff in Montana, because he said that's what we're dealing with, cookie cutter cuts. I'm going to show you some scenes from A Strange Harvest, a composite, that will give you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of the classic mutilations. And just prior to this, I wanted to at least get across also the ambience. Bud is talking about people who have stood and felt like they had no will of their own, have been powerless to move. In 1978, east of Colorado Springs, where between 1975 and 1979, there were approximately an estimate of 550 mutilation reports in sheriff's files in the state of Colorado in that period. So you're talking about a lot of law enforcement reports. So you had these repetitive patterns, repetitive pastures, and sheriffs and ranchers were beginning to form, the ranchers especially, little vigilante groups of their own. In this one particular case, 6 ranchers with guns went out in a pickup truck to a pasture where there had been repetitive mutilations. And on this particular night, they are there and they have their guns when they see what they say later looked like a helicopter. The helicopter is coming toward them and they're standing there watching it. Stops in the air, descends to the pasture, and these men do not move. And what they said later, the hair went up on the back of their necks and they felt they could not move. Now, they didn't say they were paralyzed. And it could be stark terror, but that's not their description. It is simply they feel the hair go up on the back of their necks and they feel like they can't move or don't want to move. Later, whatever this is, rises back up in the air and went right back exactly the direction from which it came. Now, the next thing you would expect is that those men would move out into the pasture. And they didn't. They went and got back in the truck, and they all went back home. They did not go back out into the pasture until after sunrise the next morning, and they went out with the sheriff. And in the exact same pasture where they had been standing with their guns are 2 mutilated cows 30 feet from each other. What all of that adds up to is something that is so bizarre and so strange that when you tell these kinds of stories, they sound like science fiction. And with that as a context of dozens and dozens of stories like that, people who feel like they've been paralyzed in the presence of something that they think is a helicopter. Why? When you ask, it's because the focus of the light comes down like this, and they say it looks like a police helicopter. But when you ask, did you see the red lights or white lights or green lights or anything else? No, it was the triangular beam. So that's their definition of the helicopter, a triangular beam of light. There have been animals that have been found in the snow alive 7 o'clock the night before. One case, a horse 30 feet from the back door of a house, the bedroom at the end of the house, the corral 30 feet, not yards, 30 feet. A 9-month Arabian stallion, prize horse. Rancher went out and fed that horse at 7 o'clock in the evening. The next morning is back in the kitchen, 7 o'clock, 12 hours later. Looks out and to his astonishment sees his horse lying down in the snow and knows something's wrong. Goes out there and finds not a single track in the snow of anything, including his horse. But in the rectum area is a hole that is 12 inches in diameter, coned in to the body of the animal 12 inches. The skin was not only bloodless, it was dry. To touch it, it was desiccated, and that was in the sheriff and the police report later. And the eye that was up, facing the sky, and it was open, not closed, was a complete and total opaque silver blue. And the horse was alive and well 12 hours earlier. That is to give you sort of a context of what we're talking about, the bizarreness. In those 12 hours, 3 dogs in that house, they did not wake up, there was no barking. Something terrible happened in those 12 hours that night, and not a single person or animal responded to what happened in that corral. And with that as a context to separate this from the constant, you will hear people say, it's predator, it's cult, it's media hysteria. I'm saying to those people who say that, they have not studied at all what animal mutilations are about, and the parallel with taking the same kinds of areas, sexual organs, and then other eye, ear, and tongue. There's this parallel in the human abduction, but the animals are killed, the humans are not. The humans are traumatized, but some of the same areas seem to be under observation. And if we could, I'd like to go and show some excerpts now that would underscore what I'm talking about.
I'd like to take that after we deal with Bruce at this time.
Okay.
But I would like to comment on what you've said so far. And that is that what we learn from this, when we can separate ourselves from our desire not to know, and not to know what our subconscious does know about this, is obviously and clinically speaking, empirically speaking, we are getting data as to the powers of these people, their technology, what they are capable of doing to our minds, to our bodies, to our will, to our movement, and of course surgically very much advanced beyond us.
One thing that Linda said, that when she said people glibly make these assertions that it's media hysteria or coyotes or something, and they don't know the material, they have not looked into it. I was on a television program recently with Carl Sagan, and although we were on different subjects, and he said, but we had a long conversation, it's a long story, but the basic point was, he said that we should have better evidence. And then he said, after all, he said, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. And I said, well, there's no doubt that this phenomenon exists as a phenomenon. We have these mutilated animals, whatever, but we certainly have all these UFO photographs, radar reports, anecdotal accounts, ground traces, the things that Stan was talking about, and so on. I said that all exists for sure. And I said it seems to me that what we should say instead is that an extraordinary phenomenon demands an extraordinary investigation. And but the basic point is the evidence is there, and it is no longer possible, it seems to me, for science, so many scientists, to turn their backs on it.
As a follow-up, just the glibness of the skeptic, there are people who will say, well, people under hypnosis will make up any kind of story to please the hypnotist. As Bud will certify, and has in the past certainly, a number of people, dozens of people that he has worked with, remember the total experience and don't require any hypnosis to bring it out. Secondly, the reverse. You have, what, a couple of dozen people who have gone under hypnosis with the possibility that maybe there was an abduction involved, who have not had an abduction experience. So the fact that there are these two groups, people who remember without hypnosis and people who don't produce an abduction under hypnosis, is clear proof that it is not a result, that the abduction story is not a result of the peculiar circumstances of hypnotic regression, let's say, or trying to please the hypnotist. And as in most cases, the people aren't pleased at all themselves, I should add. So there are glib explanations from people who don't examine the evidence. That's the bane of our existence.
Well, I think that we need to move forward as a part of the people of this planet who are willing to face reality, the actualities of our time, and look at it, and not be concerned about the non-believers and those who have too much fear to face it, because one day, this evidence being so overwhelming, they will have to look at it. So, Bruce, I'd like to talk to you about General Nathan Twining, who eventually became the Air Force Chief of Staff and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he wrote a memo on flying discs in 1947 that demonstrated his belief in UFOs. I'd like you to comment on that and show you the slides you have on that topic.
Okay, if I could have the first slide up front. You've heard now really an overview of the situation almost from A to Z. We haven't really talked about specific UFO sightings in any particular detail, but we have covered the idea of government cover-up going back a long time and going up to the newest stuff that's been discovered about perhaps the alien intentions. We were just talking a few minutes ago about the evidence and the importance of evidence, and that we should have an extraordinary investigation to find out whether there is evidence. I'm reminded of a statement a lawyer made to me, however, which was that in a legal case, hard evidence, proof, if you will, often is not very important. The hard evidence can often be refuted. All you have to do is get the experts to start wrangling over points, and it all falls apart. What proves a case in court is the circumstantial evidence. Can you provide a history of who, what, where, why, when, how, etc., that all sticks together? And if you can do that, then you're very likely to get a positive decision in a court of law based on your circumstantial evidence case, regardless of whether there was hard evidence. And so what I want to do is really sort of drop back in history now and show you how this whole thing, this whole government cover-up aspect may have begun way back 41 years ago, starting in July of 1947. And there have been arguments for years over whether or not the failure of the U.S. government to come to grips with this problem was a result of a foul-up or a cover-up. Were the Project Blue Book investigators actually sufficiently naive to believe that they had explained all the cases, and the few cases they hadn't explained were irrelevant? Or was it a situation that was, well, as I've mentioned before, they're sort of their job, in the viewpoint of the CIA, they were doing a good job if they simply divided the unexplained from the explained and left it at that. You would expect that if this were a scientific investigation, you'd take the unexplained cases and try to find out, why are they unexplained? What do you learn from studying unexplained cases? Well, we know now, as a result of information that came out over the last 20 years, this document is almost 20 years old now, but primarily over the last 10 years, that the government was not, the intelligence agencies in the government, and particularly the Air Force, they were not so stupid after all. Here is a document here written by General Nathan Twining, who was the head of the Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time. It was called Wright Field. And he is responding in this letter to a request from another general. This other general had asked for an opinion on these reports of flying saucers that the Air Force intelligence had collected. And if you can look, if the man could zero in on the number 2 here on this document, maybe blow that up a little bit. It says, it is the opinion that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious, and goes on to describe characteristics of the objects. And by the time he gets to the end of this letter, which is a secret letter from him to another general, he says we ought to set up an investigation. He lists a bunch of agencies that should be contacted, that should be in on it. And he also pointed out in this secret level letter that there was no hardware to prove it, but on the other hand there was an awful lot of, let's say, software or circumstantial evidence that there was something going on. We will tackle the hardware, his statement about hardware, later on, but just for the point, the main point is that here he starts off his letter by saying the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. And then at the end of the letter, he essentially directs this other general to set up an intelligence collection effort, which is really a formal document that goes out to the various branches of the air, in that case it was the Army Intelligence Agency, to collect all the information they could about these flying saucers. So clearly they were taking it seriously right from the beginning. What this suggests is the top levels of the intelligence organization in the Air Force knew something about UFOs, flying saucers, that they weren't telling the other people. On the other hand, the public statements of the Air Force at the time generally poo-pooed the subject. there were all sorts of, this is back in the summer of 1947 when it all began, and there were all sorts of explanations flying around, and misidentifications and hoaxes were some of the most important identifications. Misidentification meaning that a person sees something that he can't identify, he makes a report to a group of supposed experts who analyze the information in the report and say, oh, you thought that was a flying saucer, in fact it was a Goodyear blimp, or oh, you thought it was a flying saucer, in fact it was Superman going by. Some mundane explanation like that. Well, the intelligence agencies, as I said, poo-pooed the subject and the witnesses publicly, and that put a general damper on everything from the civilian point of view. Scientists were not immune to this initial cover-up. I'm jumping up now to a document written by a scientist in November 1951, Project Twinkle final report, written by a man, Louis Elterman, who was at the Air Force Geophysics Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Project Twinkle had been set up to collect information, photographic evidence if possible, on a series of unusual sightings of what were called green fireballs over the Southwest in 1948, 1949, and 1950. They had companies down there working at White Sands, the missile test areas where they launched some of the early missiles, including the German missiles that they had captured and some of our early designs for missiles. These scientists who were tracking the missiles were asked to use their equipment if, by any chance, some unusual object, circular, 10 feet in diameter, dome disc, etc., some unusual object should happen to fly by. Oh, by the way, there is one. Please take a Ascania phototheodolite, which is a device that gives you the altitude, that gives you the elevation and azimuth, and photograph it for us. Well, now this report is 1951. By the time this report was written, all the studies had been, quote, completed, unquote, and this was the final report. And the first page of that final report, at the top sentence says, referring to a particular time period between April 1950 and September 1950, it says, some photographic activity occurred on the 27th of April and the 24th of May, 1950, but simultaneous sightings by both cameras were not made, so that no information was gained. Simultaneous sightings by both cameras were not made, so we didn't learn anything. Immediately that should put a little bit of a question mark. You know, what did they sight simultaneously on both cameras that he's sweeping under the rug here? Fortunately, because of a diligent investigator who looked through the Air Force file on the microfilm record, I can tell you what it was. And in this paragraph, he goes on to refer to other events. In August 1950, several events where many dozens of these technicians who were working at White Sands saw groups of objects flying over, but didn't succeed in getting any film. Well, what was he referring to? A document, what was he referring to with this simultaneous sightings were on different objects, and so no information was gained. There was found in the Project Blue Book file a unassuming document, 2 pages long, which referred to the 27th of April and the 24th of May 1950, when, lo and behold, objects appeared on both of these dates, flying. I don't know if anybody's been down around the Alamogordo, White Sands area, but it's a big valley between 2 mountain chains. Objects appeared over one of these mountain chains, and some observers spotted them and immediately contacted the phototheodolite men. Now, these guys all had earphones on. They had just carried out rocket tests. Okay, so they still had film. Some of them still had film in their cameras. They still had their earphones on. Hey, there's one. Quick, get on that microphone. And suddenly, a bunch of people are looking up in the sky. And it says that on 2 days, this happened. On one of the days, they got phototheodolite film. But upon analysis, it was determined that what they filmed were 2 different objects. Now, Elterman was saying that we didn't gain any information. The information they wanted to know was how far away are the objects, and therefore we could figure out how big they were. In fact, these 2 theodolites, one was pointing at an object here and one was pointing at an object there. They were real objects that the people didn't identify, but because it wasn't the same object, no information was gained, and therefore Elterman in his official report could say, no information was gained, go on to the next thing, sweep it under the rug. What he didn't say was that on one of these particular days, following a specific rocket test on the 27th of April, they had sufficient photographic information to make a triangulation on an object. And here's the report by a mathematician of the mathematical reduction unit there. They immediately took the film in, they developed it, they calibrated their theodolites, and the net result was that these objects were flying at an altitude of 150,000 feet, were 30 feet in diameter, were flying at a high but undetermined speed, and were over the Tularosa mountain chain, which would put them east of Alamogordo Air Force Base. This information is not even referred to in Elterman's report, which was the final report from Project Twinkle. That was circulated to a number of Air Force and intelligence agencies. Here's the result of our 3 years' worth of effort to collect information. And basically he said, well, we had a lot of sightings of things, but later on in the report he says, probably they could all have been identified as birds or balloons or things just flying by. This document is in the Project Blue Book record, was not referred to at all by Elterman. Is that a cover-up or a foul-up? He was the project director. He was the guy that all the information flowed to. You make up your own mind. Here I just talked about Louis Elterman, who was a scientist. The Air Force intelligence people who collected reports were of the same bent, shall we say, to sweep things under the rug. In 1949, a group of 5 people who were fishing on the Rogue River in Oregon saw an object. I will show you a drawing of it. 2 of those gentlemen were employees of the Ames Research Laboratory, where they were doing some of the early experiments on jet engines. They were working at a classified defense installation. Within a week after they had had this sighting, in the company of 3 other people, 2 men, actually there are 3 men and 2 women involved, 2 of the men worked at Ames. They made a report directly to their security agency, the security office, and this right here is a little thing saying the security office is requesting an investigation by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Basically, the security office is saying, these 2 guys came in, they told us this weird story, we think you should look into it. So here's an official request to do an investigation. The AFOSI people sicked their local intelligence agencies on these 2 men, interviewed them not once, but twice independently, second time asking them to sign affidavits. These long verbal descriptions of what they saw I won't bother to read, but each person said that he had over a minute to look at this thing through binoculars, and it was generally described as being, when seen by the naked eye, it looked like a shiny thing, like a coin seen on edge, and when you looked at it through binoculars it became a pancake-shaped thing with a fin on the top, and one guy said that the edge of it looked wrinkled or dirty. Now, if you can see an object well enough to think that the surface looks wrinkled or dirty, you can certainly see the overall shape. In other words, the shape description that they were giving is highly credible. One man was a draftsman working at Ames, the other guy was a wind tunnel mechanic. And of course there were the 3 other people who had also seen it. Well, the intelligence officer carried out a long investigation, interviewed everybody, collected all the information. He also attempted to come up with an explanation in terms of, well, what could have been in the air over Rogue River at the time. And he found that radar kites were launched in San Francisco, which is some 300 miles southeast of the mouth of the Rogue River. So he put into his report, perhaps these were radar kites. Here on the right-hand side, it shows at the top, it shows balloons. And down below the balloons, 4 balloons holding it up, is a folded piece of aluminum foil. This is a radar kite. And if you go to the Project Blue Book records and you look up the date of this sighting, you look in this catalog at the beginning of the microfilm record. The catalog tells you what dates the sightings were, a little bit of information, and the identification. And it's identified as kites, okay? This is the real cover of Special Report 14, as opposed to a published commercial version. In Project Blue Book Special Report 14, which Stan referred to earlier, we found a sketch based on the verbal descriptions, the very detailed verbal descriptions. And you can compare this shape of a round pancake-shaped object with a tail on it, some sort of louvers or something around the edge. This object was described as coming into their view, hovering, rotating on a vertical axis, not banking or anything like a plane, rotating on an axis, then speeding up and taking off, accelerating to the speed of a jet plane within a minute or so. Now, am I to believe that this is a radar kite?
A fast one.
This is one of the faster radar kites in the world. There were a number of scientists in the early days who made sightings which were effectively swept under the rug. One famous debunking scientist from the Naval Research Laboratory said that all credible UFO sightings, and by this he meant sightings where the person who described what he saw, he was a credible person, he probably gave an accurate description. All credible UFO sightings were actually sightings of skyhook balloons. In 1947, the Navy, it may seem strange that it was the Navy, but the Navy started launching high-altitude research balloons, balloons which would expand to a diameter of 100 feet and reach an altitude of 100,000 feet. Ostensibly, this was for high-altitude research. The intelligence agencies that were involved really wanted to be able to send some of these balloons with cameras all the way around the world and then retrieve the cameras. Be that as it may, in the early 50s, it was by this time known that these experiments were going on. And Dr. Erner Liddell said all UFO sightings which are credible are sightings that people make sightings of these high-altitude balloons up in the sky at sunrise or sunset when they're illuminated by the sun. They're very brilliant. What he didn't say or didn't know was that many of the early sightings were made by the gentleman who actually launched these balloons at the same time that the balloons were in the air. Here's a listing of them. I'll very briefly discuss a few. In 1951, a balloon had been launched near Artesia, New Mexico. Some gentlemen were standing in the airport watching the balloon way up overhead. Gee, look at that balloon up there. Oh, what are these two things coming along? They go and make a circle around the balloon, flipping up on edge as they do it. Just a couple more flying saucers, that's all. But these were the guys who launched the balloon. Surely they could determine what was the balloon and what wasn't the balloon. Later on in 1951, two gentlemen flying along in an airplane were tracking a balloon which their group had launched. This was near Minneapolis, Minnesota. And they were flying south, and to their east something comes along and does this very strange sort of a maneuver, flying along, reversing its direction, going through a loop, and then shooting straight up. And it was described in shape as being your standard Model A disc type of thing, not the balloon. The next day, the same gentleman, also a bunch of people on the ground, had another sighting, again a bizarre situation in terms of the aerodynamics or the dynamics of motion, where an object came from their left, slowed down and went into a reverse spiral upwards. Instead of like floating down like a leaf might do, it floated up in a spiral shape and then went back off into the direction it had come. This was, they're tracking a balloon, and here this interloper comes into their field of view. These, oddly enough, were people who worked for the General Mills Corporation. They were doing the high-altitude balloon launches at the time. Now here is another later sighting by a meteorologist who watched a thing through his theodolite instead of flying in a straight path. Well, one object flew in a straight path, another object oscillated above and below that straight path. Yet another theodolite sighting where a man saw this object come along, go through a loop, and then disappeared. Now, those were people, as I said, who were scientists working on projects where their job was to look in the sky and be able to distinguish things like birds and whatever that would distract them from what they were trying to track, the balloon. One group of scientists that was involved, one of the earliest sightings involving these balloon launching gentlemen, was in 1949, April 24th, 1949. And it was declared as one of the best UFO sightings, most detailed, most credible observers, etc. Multiple witness sighting people, these gentlemen viewed the thing through a telescope. The best sighting up until 1952. It was so declared by none other than the late Dr. Donald H. Menzel, who was the head of the Harvard Observatory at the time, a well-known astrophysicist. literally known throughout the world for his work on astrophysics. He had been involved in eclipse expedition to Russia. Not so well known was that he had been in intelligence during the Second World War. And I might point out my mention of Menzel will lead subsequently to MJ-12. But this is an interesting study by itself. Menzel had said nothing about UFOs up until the summer of 1952, when there was a big flap in the United States, especially around the Washington, D.C. area. There were a lot of sightings. Menzel was quoted as saying that it was all a result of atmospheric refractions, distant lights on the horizon being bent by the atmosphere and appearing in oddball directions and so on. In 1953, he published a book that tried to back up his claim. In the book, he referred to these sightings of 24 April 1949 involving 4 men in the desert in New Mexico near White Sands who were tracking a balloon. It was actually a man by the name of Moore, Charles B. Moore, who was still alive and lives in Roswell, New Mexico, and 4 Navy enlisted men. Moore was teaching the Navy enlisted men how to track a balloon. And one of the Navy men was watching the balloon, and Moore, the Navy man, was watching through the telescope. Moore was looking with his naked eyes. He looked up, he saw a white object up there, and he could look and see that the telescope was pointing in another direction. After cursing for a few seconds, because these balloons are expensive, he grabbed the theodolite, thinking that the Navy man had lost the balloon and the theodolite was tracking the wrong thing. He switched over to this other object and realized it was moving very fast. He switched the theodolite back, there was the balloon. Better track this other thing. He switched back to the thing that was moving, and he tracked it through a large arc in motion, and subsequently published a story saying it was a very high altitude and traveling very fast. Well, this story was reported in Life magazine along with a bunch of other sightings in spring of 1952, and Menzel tackled this particular case. Now, it is important to note that Menzel had clearances that would give him access to any Air Force records virtually that he wanted, including the records of the project, which was called Grudge at the time, that was collecting reports such as this. Menzel said in one of his books that he had in fact been called in by the Air Force to offer explanations for cases. The implication is that Menzel had access to the actual information on this sighting. But what did he put in his book? He put in his book a highly watered down version, and it's sort of well, first of all, his book was an attempt to be portrayed as very scientific. Here is an experiment that he carried out, and he photographed the experiment to show how the atmosphere can refract things. It's actually a little experiment in a jar, but the fundamental physics is the same. He argues that atmospheric refractions cause all these problems. And now, if you could center on this drawing, what this drawing is in the book, and this is Menzel's portrayal of what happened, that there's a man down here on the ground looking up at a balloon at a very high altitude, and because of a weird atmospheric effect that Menzel assumes occurred, he can't prove it, a refraction occurs and a mirage of the balloon suddenly drops downwards, hovers for a short period of time, and then shoots back up.
That's a neat trick.
This is Menzel's argument about the data in the sighting. In other words, he's in fact saying the data amount to the guy looking through the theodolite. He sees this object apparently drop downwards and then shot back up after a few seconds of hovering. And then he made this argument about the mirage effect. Doing that, he had a hypothesis which I can read to you for those of you who might be technically interested. A weather balloon breaking through the top of the inversion layer, where there might be a high temperature above a low temperature in the atmosphere, will carry with it a bubble of hot air. The overlying layer will sag into the hotter level and momentarily act like a big lens in the atmosphere. It's all very technical stuff, focusing whatever happens to be above it. Thus, it may produce a distorted image of the balloon. This is all a hypothesis that Menzel generates just for this one case. He backed it up, if you could show the top of this page, an appendix in the book, Theory of Mirages. 20 or 30 pages on how mirages occur and how his hypothesized very special type of mirage might have occurred. And he summarizes by saying this incident, kept in classified files for more than 2 years, presents no serious difficulty to the person who understands the unusual aspects of the Earth's atmosphere. The air can, under special conditions, produce formations similar to lenses. This is a statement he's making based on a long series of very tenuous assumptions. And just as a burning glass can project the sun. What Moore, that man who was the witness, saw was an out-of-focus and badly astigmatic image of the balloon above. Okay, that's his claim in the book. Now here's the guy who's the head of the Harvard Observatory, the first scientist to write a book on UFO, on the UFO subject. When libraries decided to buy books on the subject, who did they turn to? Some of the hack writers in the field? No, I mean a man with authority, Donald Menzel. And so the readers of Menzel's book thought, well, Menzel obviously has explained this sighting by Charles Moore and 4 enlisted men, and this was, he said, the best sighting around. If he can explain the best, why even worry about the next best? Well, once the Project Blue Book files were released, which was 20 years after Menzel's book was released, anybody could go there and find out the object report, the actual report by Charles Moore and his gentlemen of what really happened that day. And you could ask yourself, does it square with what Menzel said? Here is this long description of all the events that occurred, and his signature down at the bottom. He was the head of the General Mills Aeronautical Research Division at the time, a man with authority. You have to know what he's talking about. And if you use that report to plot the data, as it were, his sighting directions, his azimuths as he gave in this report, you find that this object didn't just start from a point up here, drop downwards, and go up. It made a great big arc around them like that. In fact, if you were to plot on graph paper the actual sighting directions, it started from one initial sighting in the southwest and ended up in the northeast. And one thing that apparently attracted Moore to this sighting was that he says that this thing was going off into the distance. It started, before it disappeared, it started to rise upwards, as if it were leaving the Earth's atmosphere. Well, Menzel in his book, in his appendix, had created a theory which said that if this mirage theory was right, the image of the object is up here, could drop downwards by a certain amount, and that amount could be 1/4 of a degree. That's a teeny-weeny amount, about half the angular size of the moon. And as I said, he had backed up his theory with this big, long, he's backed up his claim with this big, long theoretical dissertation, which nevertheless was based on a bunch of tenuous arguments. But to the outside observer, not an expert in atmospheric physics, this could seem very convincing, especially coming with the authority of Dr. Menzel. If you look at the original data, the sighting angle from the initial position to the final position is from here to here. That's 120 degrees, only 400 times larger than the largest angle that Menzel's theory would allow. What that means is, if Dr. Menzel had put the actual report into his book, written down, just copied Moore's report and then said, now I'll explain it, any intelligent person could have seen that Menzel's theory didn't hold water. To reverse the argument, in a sense, the only way to make his theory stick was to distort the data so much that there was virtually nothing to the sighting after he got finished with it. Now, was this intentional or was this an accident? Menzel was known as being a very thorough scientist. He'd written lots of books on theory and experiment and so on. Could it be that in the UFO business he just had such a blind spot that he was willing to write almost anything, providing he did it carefully, to explain sightings? Or was this an intentioned effort on his part to get rid of this sighting, because being the best, he had to get rid of the best first, and then he could go on and take the rest on. Keep that in mind when we talk a little bit later about Kirtland. Menzel's deceit is what I call this. Menzel did not report the initial and final angles of elevation and azimuth. If he had, any intelligent person could have determined that the maximum angle between the balloon and the other object far exceeded Menzel's calculated 1/4 degree maximum. So in other words, if he had put the actual data in the sighting in his book, as I said, anybody could have seen what was going on. I gave you ancient history, 1950 stuff. Let's jump up to 1980 and ask, is the cover-up still going on? Project Blue Book ended in 1969 officially. Stan has mentioned that the Bollinger Memorandum said that any sightings that were of real importance weren't part of the Project Blue Book system anyway. So really important sightings were not impacted by the ending of sightings. We know that in 1975 there were SAC-based flyovers that generated a lot of stuff. Linda talked about that when her brother was involved. 1976 Iranian jet case, other events, but what I want to narrow in right now is 1980, Kirtland Air Force Base. A document was leaked which states that on, I forget exactly which day, 8th or 10th of August 1980, a object was observed flying over or in the vicinity of the Manzano weapons storage area. If any of you people are familiar at all with Kirtland and Albuquerque, New Mexico, there are mountains just east of Albuquerque, and part of this mountain chain is known as the Manzano mountain range, and they have a nuclear storage area there, highly secure area, you know, no man's land, great big cleared, I don't know, 40 or 50 feet wide bulldozed area with multiple fences and so on. Behind this range are military reservations where tests and things are carried out. One night, the guards for this Manzano weapons storage area saw some brightly lighted object going back and forth doing weird maneuvers. They thought at first it was a helicopter, but decided after seeing its right angle turns and so on that it wasn't a helicopter, and then it dropped down out of their view behind some mountains. This document summarizes their sighting and goes on to another sighting only half an hour later, which talks about a security guard at the Sandia base. Sandia is a scientific establishment right adjacent to Kirtland Air Force Base. And it says that a guard from Sandia was out in the area at the time, and that he saw behind, to use the term, an alarmed structure, which is a little building with a fence around it and an alarm that if somebody breaks into it, the alarm will go off. Obviously something of value in there. Behind this building, he saw a bright light. He tried to phone for help. His radio wouldn't work, which was strange. He was only about 3 miles away from headquarters. This is a photograph of the Manzano weapons storage area, and he was just a little bit east of that, just, you know, typical mountains that you see down Albuquerque. He was over in this area on the right-hand side of that picture half an hour after the guards in the left-hand side of this picture had seen an object go down in this area. He saw this brightly lighted object, and he described it as being, at first he saw a bright light, and then he approached it and he said it was a round, disc-shaped object. He phoned for help with his Jeep, from his Jeep radio, it didn't work. He got out his shotgun and started to walk towards it. Well, you know, here's a guy with guts. As he approached, the thing suddenly took off straight up. Independently, these guards over here said about half an hour after they saw the thing disappear behind the mountains over there, a little mountain chain in this area, they suddenly saw this bright light shoot straight up. So it sounds like you've got a multiple witness sighting from 2 locations of a round disc-shaped object that had a bright light on it. As I said, this document was leaked. I made an extensive effort to investigate this thing. I went and talked to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent who wrote that document. And he implied to me in many subtle ways that there was more information on this sighting than just a 2-page document on it. And it certainly sounded convincing to me. I asked him, did you do an investigation? Did you talk to the witness? Did you go to the location and have him relive it? He said, yes, 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 yes. Sounded like a good investigation. Fine, where's the rest of the report? You'll have to write to headquarters to find out what they will release. So over a period of a few months, I kept writing to headquarters, and as Stan has mentioned before, I was asking for oranges, and they said, oh, we have no cantaloupes. We don't have any apples either. Well, please, it's the oranges that I'm interested in. We don't have any bananas.
The runaround, they call it.
The upshot of that was I never did get anything out of OSI headquarters in regard to what presumably would have generated, you know, a considerable investigation of a round disc-shaped object landing on a secure military installation, and then the guard not being able to do anything about it. Now, it's interesting to note the last statement with respect to that argument, that sighting, was by the guard. The guard says he was a former helicopter mechanic. This was not a helicopter. Now, recently, in the last few weeks, I note that the man who wrote the document, a man by the name of Doty, has been saying, oh, if you check, you will find that there was a helicopter in the area at the time. Well, I don't buy that. Obviously, he's trying to waffle and change the story. He was very adamant to me that what was in that document was absolutely accurate when I talked to him in 1984. Now, 4 years later, it appears that he's trying to backtrack. But in the document, it says that the guy who was closest to it, the guard, and it says he was only about 500 feet away, would have heard a chop, chop, chop sound at the very least, was a helicopter mechanic. If a helicopter mechanic can't identify a helicopter from 500 feet, it has often been said that not necessarily Air Force, but any intelligence organization, military intelligence is a self-contradiction in terms. This, by the way, is a photograph of a portion of the stack of FBI documents. I don't know what else I've got here. In one of the FBI pile of FBI documents was an interesting letter. This jumps back in history now. There had been often arguments that, these flying saucers were actually secret military craft of the U.S. government. And the Air Force even went so far as to trot out some photographs of a pancake-shaped or flapjack-shaped aircraft that was undergoing tests. And they said, gee, they left the impression that, gee, maybe the witnesses saw this. What they did not say was that said pancake-shaped craft was only tested in a highly restricted area and managed to get a few feet off the ground before, in one case, almost destroying itself. Certainly was not flying at many thousands of feet altitude at high speed. But when this all began, the Air Force decided, or rather the FBI decided, that they would ask the Air Force whether or not the Air Force was in fact carrying out any tests of devices that could generate flying saucer reports. So whereas publicly the Air Force was allowing the populace to believe, oh yes, perhaps this is an Air Force project, on the one hand. On the other hand, they were saying it's not the Air Force. It must have been very confusing to anybody alive back then. Of course, I was alive back then too, and I was obviously confused, but not by this. I was worried about other things at the time. J. Edgar Hoover was not about to be confused. He said, contact the top general and find out. And so here's the top general's response to J. Edgar Hoover. And of course, if you can't trust the top general to respond accurately to J. Edgar Hoover, who can you trust? Well, maybe Prestone. Anyway, he says there was no Air Force project that could give rise to flying saucer reports. Subsequently, the Air Force interest, both publicly and privately on this subject, went up and down, had its ups and downs. And the FBI, in their in the documents generated by the FBI in the late 40s and early 50s, gave us a window on the Air Force opinion which we hadn't had before 1977 when these documents came out. And one thing we found out was that in 1952, when all these flying saucer sightings in the United States were occurring, it says here, air intelligence still feels flying saucers are optical illusions or, I can't really read what this says. Atmospheric something or others.
Phenomena.
But some officials are seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. So it's clear that inside the Air Force intelligence there were some people who were intelligent. Okay, that sort of concludes my presentation.